Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2021 session overview. On behalf of APA Florida, I'm President-elect Whit Blanton, and really pleased to be here today with Alex McGee, who is our Executive Director, and Lester Abinger, who will help me give the presentation along with Alex. Lester is our man in Tallahassee, as many of you know. Well, I guess, Alex, you're our woman in Tallahassee, too.
Yes,
Um,
I
and I'm over here in Clearwater, Florida, so we really appreciate having you all there to keep tabs on the legislature and keep our members apprised of what's happening with the legislative issues that we're facing here in Florida. And we just wrapped up a session, and there's some good, there's some bad, there's some ugly, and we'll try to cover that as best we can today. I do want to say that it's important that you work locally with your attorneys at the local level and with your staff at the local level and board members and everybody, because how you interpret and apply some of these legislative changes in your community is going to be subject to your local conditions in a lot of cases. So we'll give you the high level overview, but just be aware that you'll have to have that deeper dive. And then there is a link to reading the bills themselves and making sure that you understand all the provisions. I'd like to thank our annual sponsors for their continued support of our program here at APA Florida: Theriac in Spain, VHB, Wade Trim, and Plus Urbia. Without them, we couldn't be doing what we're doing. And as we get started, I do want to remind folks that if you have questions, you can type those into the Q&A feature. And we will try to answer those questions as time allows as we go forward. And if we can't answer all your questions today, we'll try to follow up with you. So APA Florida's Legislative and Policy Committee, which I chair, is really the point of focus on the legislative and policy positions that not only APA Florida takes, but how we work with our partners throughout the state on allied efforts to either support or oppose different aspects of legislation. The Legislative Policy Committee is comprised of section representatives and at-large representatives who are appointed by the president of APA Florida. Everybody serves a 2-year term, which is good because most of our state representatives are all serving 2-year terms, and it gives the ability to get up to speed and have some fresh perspectives as well. Alex sends out a bill tracking report periodically throughout the session. I believe about every week that goes out when things are happening hot and heavy. And this is really our wrap up based on that bill tracking that we've done all during the session. And really it starts during committee weeks, the run up to the session. We have legislative reporters as well. The Planners Month in the District is something that we did for the first time this past December, and I thought it was a pretty successful first effort to build relationships with legislative members from your local community. And that's really the point here, is to establish a relationship, to share with them what we do at APA Florida and what planners and the planning profession is all about, and how without us, communities don't grow and prosper and thrive the way they should. And that's an important message that we try to convey. We did have a public policy workshop back in February, and that was February 24th and 25th. I hope you were able to attend that. That's always a really nice way to kick off the legislative session and really get members primed for what's likely to happen. This year, we are working to build on the successful Planners Month in the District with another effort that we'll undertake in the fall. We're targeting September, but we're going to give everybody a pretty good window of opportunity to get that done. And the Legislative and Policy Committee is working right now to help define priorities that we will feature in those Planners Months in the districts later this year. And you can see the handout on this slide of what we used last year, and we'll try to do something very similar that's written in a way that somebody will actually read it and look at it. It's meant to be a quick synopsis of our priority platform. And we're also going to make sure we take the time to thank the legislature for the things that we can thank them for, and don't just go in there tell them what they need to do better next time. So stay tuned for that information, and I think you'll find it a really enlightening and great opportunity to meet your legislative delegation members, whether they be in the House or Senate. Finally, I want to mention that APA has a planners advocacy network that's nationwide, and it stitches together planners in all the states and chapters so that we can share tips and information about what's happening across the states, and use what may be going on in say Virginia or North Carolina or Georgia or Texas, and try to replicate that if it's good, or work with them if it's something that we need to band together and try and oppose. There is a way to join that. It's free to join. It really is just an avenue for you to share insights and participate in advocacy throughout the country. And this is a big part of supporting APA National's Legislative and Policy Committee, of which I'm a member and a former chair. And we really do rely on this grassroots network that can really help advance good policy in all 50 states. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lester to give a highlight of what his observations have been in Tallahassee and the legislature this past session. Lester?
Thank you, Whit. I appreciate it. Well, this really has been a session like no other, obviously due to the COVID-19 restrictions. Access to the Capitol was very, very limited. The metaphor that I found useful as a way to think about this is that this was a session in the bubble, in that, as those of you who've been to Tallahassee know, at the rear of both of the legislative chambers, there are little soundproof rooms that are referred to as the bubble. And so a lot of what went on behind the scenes, as opposed to committee meetings where there was ample opportunity for testimony and that sort of thing. Notwithstanding that, about the typical number of bills filed, some 3,140, a lot of votes taken, and 275 of those bills passed, again, which is about normal, I would say. As we've discussed before, the budget is the only bill the legislature is required to pass, and the session begins and ends as usual with the budget. Interesting context, as recently as August of 2020, the state economists were projecting a $3.4 billion shortfall in the budget, meaning the difference between what the revenues expected and what it would take to maintain the level of programming or the level of services in the fiscal year budget. How things changed. The governor originally proposed a budget of $96.6 billion. The initial House budget was $97.1 billion, and the original Senate budget was $94 billion. The final budget, Senate Bill 2500, came in at $101.5 billion, which is a $9.3 billion increase over the 2021 fiscal year budget. So as I said, what changed? Well, first of all, we had some much improved revenue forecasts. For example, in December, the revenue came in at almost $900 million over the forecast. And secondly, the legislature early in the session passed a bill to implement the collection of the internet sales tax. And that's expected to yield about $1 billion or a little bit more a year. Third, a proposed deal which the legislature will meet in special session to ratify next week with the Seminole Tribe, the so-called Gambling Compact. That is expected to yield about $500 million a year over the next 5 years. And finally, last but certainly not least, Santa Claus came to town in the form of $10.6 billion from the American Relief Act to Florida. The legislature spent about $6.5 billion of that $10.6 billion during this session. They added $3.5 billion to the state's reserves, which is very prudent in my view. They dedicated, excuse me, $2 billion to fund the DOT work plan. There were a number of projects as we were in the COVID recession that were deferred. There were because gas tax receipts were down, people were not traveling as much. Toll revenues were down for the same reason, and rental car taxes, which also fund transportation, were down. So this makes up for that shortfall. They provided almost $500 million for septic to sewer conversions, which, as you all know, are extremely important to Florida's environment. They created, again, appropriately in my view, what they're calling the Emergency Response Fund. This will enable the state to respond quickly to natural disasters such as hurricanes by getting money out to local communities, and then the fund will be replenished when the FEMA reimbursements come in. $300 million in extra $300 million in Florida Forever land acquisition dollars. And then, as I said, sprinkled through some funding for cybersecurity, unemployment system upgrades, deferred maintenance on state buildings, capital projects at state university and Florida college system institutions, Visit Florida, tourist promotion, that sort of thing. We had a relatively modest tax relief package, about $200 million. The usual back to school and hurricane preparation sales tax holidays, and the addition of a new sales tax holiday called Freedom Week, which will be from the 1st to the 8th of July, and waives the sales tax on admission to music, sports events, cultural events, movies, and that sort of thing. I would say the other major trend that we watched during the session was what some reporters have described as the culture wars. That began with legislation that was adopted to bar social media companies from removing political candidates from their platforms and requiring them to publish standards that are applicable to issues such as blocking users, and it also requires a consistent application of those standards. The so-called protest or anti-riot legislation, which increased penalties for crimes such as burglary, theft, assault and battery that occur during civil disturbances. A lot of discussion on the issue of transgender athletes, essentially banning transgender girls from competing in girls and women's sports. And finally, the governor's priority of no vaccine passports, which essentially bans businesses from requiring employees, or customers to show proof of COVID-19 vaccines. Following on a national trend, 43 states, 350 bills to date on voting issues, election integrity or voter suppression, depends on where you sit. Despite near flawless 2020 elections in Florida, the legislature adopted an omnibus voting bill, which restricts the use of restricts the use of ballot drop boxes. 1.5 million Floridians used ballot drop boxes in the 2020 elections. It makes mail-in and absentee voting more difficult. I would point out that the bill that finally passed was much less onerous than the initial proposals. But as a juxtaposition for that, even the watered down version of this bill was opposed unanimously by all 67 elected county election supervisors. Similarly, there was a bill passed that will in the context of ballot initiatives. Many of you remember Amendment 1, the Conservation Ballot Initiative, or the Felon Voting Rights Ballot Initiative. This limits contributions to ballot initiative campaigns to $3,000 per person or entity. And in order to collect the some 890,000 signatures needed to put a proposal on the ballot, this is going to have a devastating effect, I think, on the ability to put ballot measures before the voters. Also, in what they call a joint resolution, which is what the legislature uses to put its own measures on the ballot, there will be a measure on the 2022 general election ballot to abolish the Constitutional Revision Commission. On the issue of affordable housing, which is a APA Florida priority, many of you remember we've talked about the sweeps of the trust fund, that the legislature has taken money dedicated to affordable housing and put it into the general revenue fund, some $2 billion of sweeps over the last 20 years. This year, affordable housing was funded at $209 million, which is the largest amount for affordable housing in the past 12 years. Although the downside of that is the legislature decided to divide the revenues generated by dock stamps or real estate transfer taxes, to divide those between affordable housing, septic to sewer conversions, and flooding and sea level rise grants. The best part about that is that they have said that there will be no more sweeps of the trust fund, which is unprecedented. So again, a 5-year average of about $160 million for affordable housing. This year came in at about $210 million. So good progress there. And of those funds, for those of you who follow housing issues, the SHIP program takes 70% of that $210 million and uses them in population-based grants. And then the SAIL program, 30% is competitive. So there'll be $147 odd million available for the SHIP program and $63 million or so for the SAIL program. In terms of other issues, just briefly, the legislature took a small but significant first step, in my view, toward police reform in the context of some of the events that have happened recently in Florida and around the country. This passed the House significantly by a bipartisan vote of 113-0. As usual, we saw a parade of preemptions, some 41 bills this year. Seaport, short-term vacation rentals, home businesses, gun ordinances, building design, police budgets, public health emergency orders, ports, gas stations, energy sources, location of solar farms, impact fees, clean energy regulation, and others. And when we get into the discussion of specific bills, we'll cover several of the more significant of those. And finally, you'd be pleased to know that added to the 120 specialty motor vehicle tags in Florida, the legislature added 14 more, including a Margaritaville tag. And finally, you will be able to take your guns to church with you now. So let's get into the bills, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
All right, thank you for that, Lester. Great overview, good context. So as Lester mentioned, only about 13% of the bills that are general bills ever pass, and those that do generally need the support of leadership. And so we have 87% of the bills that did not pass. So I'll try to be fairly brief here, but we've got a number of bills, both good and bad, that did not get through the session. One is abolishing the regional planning councils, Senate Bill 62. That would have really put a final nail in the coffin on efforts over the last decade or so to really undermine and hamper the efforts of the regional planning councils. So we expect bills like this to come back. So a lot of the bills that failed, some of them made it substantially far through the session. Some of them never got a committee hearing. Those that start making, one or two or three committee meetings and getting through the process, maybe getting through one component of the legislature and not the other, we are going to be paying special attention to, because they will be back most likely. Another one that
we weighed in very, very heavily on the Regional Planning Council bill.
Yeah, we sure did. So, and again, thank you for that. That's an important point. Creating an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the governor's office, that failed. There were several legislative efforts to amend vacation rental legislation. I know a number of communities have tried to go back and undo some of the language that was passed several years prior. None of those passed. Creating the statewide Office of Resiliency within the governor's office did not pass. Prohibiting drilling for oil or gas within the Everglades did not pass. And establishing a schedule for systemic review of occupational regulatory programs. And again, I think some of these are going to be back.
Yeah, the vacation rental will definitely be back, just as it has been for the last 5 or 6 years. That was another one that we were really involved with. My impression was the bills to try to deregulate or preempt vacation rentals, the sponsors overreached this year, and they were. It ended up that it was so onerous that they couldn't find a compromise that they could agree to.
Let's go over a few more. And again, I encourage you to look at these bills in detail if you really want to get into the weeds of them. Increasing the number of elector voters required to approve constitutional amendments. That's been under assault for a few years. That didn't pass. Creating an Energy 2040 task force within the Public Service Commission. Creating electric vehicle grant program and other related charges or changes to these vehicles. And there was a whole effort to provide not only electric vehicle charging stations, but some funding for electric vehicle charging stations to be deployed, and none of those passed this year. One of those was actually to provide a surcharge to help mitigate some of the impacts on the State Transportation Trust Fund, which is largely gas tax revenues, and that also didn't pass. And I think they're going to have to revisit that one in a few years, certainly. Establishing residency requirements for certain affordable housing did not pass. Prohibiting fracking. Here's one. They tried to repeal the preemption of tree pruning, trimming, and removal that passed either last session or the one before. So we're still stuck with that preemption of local government ordinances. And then let's see, requiring charter schools and private schools to comply with state requirements for educational facilities in the Florida Building Code didn't pass. Authorizing local governments to establish a sanitary sewer lateral inspection program. And then one that's really important to me, and over here in Pinellas County, there were bills that would have prohibited the use of mid-block crossings with rectangular rapid flashing beacons. We have over 300 of those here in Pinellas County. Some other counties have quite a few of them. There was a tragic fatality in Brevard County, and House of Representatives member Randy Fine made this for the second year in a row a real issue. It passed the House, but did not pass the Senate, and I expect this one will be back.
If I might add there, thanks to your leadership, I was able to work with the Department of Transportation and the Secretary to slow this thing down considerably.
Yeah, and I also want to thank Chuck Barmby in the city of Lakeland and the Institute of Transportation Engineers in Florida. We had a pretty good coalition
Yes.
opposing this one. And then requiring school districts to provide for remote operation of public schools, and then allowing local governments to waive fees and exempt permits related to construction of affordable housing. These all failed. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex to talk about some of the things that made it through the legislature and are either on their way or have been approved by the governor.
Okay, thank you, Whit. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to keep my camera off while I'm speaking. I've got a problem with my right eye and I don't want it to be distracting. So I'm going to not have my webcam on when I'm talking. So I apologize for that. So let's talk about some of the bills that did pass. What was in the 13.5%? The first bill I want to talk about is the House Bill 59, which was the property rights element bill. And this is going to look familiar to many of you. We've seen versions of this bill since 2014. Senator Perry has been filing bills since then that deal with this issue. House Bill 59 was sponsored by Representative McClain. It passed in the House 82 to 32 and was unanimously passed in the Senate. And as it states, it requires a local comp plan to include the property rights element, and you have to include it by your next proposed plan amendment that's initiated after July 1st of this year, or the next year-based amendment that you do. It lays out 4 rights that local governments have to consider: the right to possess and control your interest in your property, the right of the owner to use and maintain and develop his property, the right to privacy and to exclude others from the property, and the right to dispose of the property through sale or through a gift. So this is kind of the model statement of property rights that's included in the bill, and local governments can either incorporate that directly or they can come up with their own element. But if they come up with their own element, it can't conflict with these 4 rights. The bill also includes some other amendments. It amends 163.3167, and it states now that the local comp plan for a newly incorporated municipality that is effective, it used to say adopted, but it's effective now after January 1, 2016, and the LDRs have to incorporate the development orders that existed before the plan's effective date. It also allows development agreements, the parties to the development agreement or their designated successor, to amend or cancel the agreement without consulting the other property owners whose property was originally subject to the agreement, unless the change directly modifies the uses or entitlements of the other property owners. And then it does require DOT, if it is disposing of land or property that it no longer needs, DOT now is required to give a right of first refusal to whoever owned the property before. And this, however, doesn't apply if it's been more than 10 years since the department, got a hold of that property. And then we always have to have some DRI related change. So this says that development agreements for essentially built out DRIs can be amended, and it allows developers to exchange approved land uses through that amendment if they can show that the exchange doesn't increase impacts to public facilities. And this applies to agreements and amendments that are effective on or after April 6, 2018. So the effective date of this bill is July 1. And as of yesterday afternoon, it had not been submitted to the governor. So the next bill I want to talk about is one that deals with building design elements and the application of those to single family and 2-family homes. There were originally two bills filed. One was House Bill 55, and that was filed by Representative Overdorf. And then there was Senate Bill 284 that was filed by Senator Perry. The House bill actually passed the House and was sent to the Senate, and then both the Senate bill and the House bill died in the Rules Committee. So when this House Bill 401, the Florida Building Code, came before the Senate, Senator Perry filed an amendment to this bill to include the language dealing with the building design elements, and it was adopted. So what does this do? It creates a new subsection in 163, and it identifies building design elements as color, cladding material, styling of windows or doors, location, orientation of the garage. It doesn't include the height, the bulk, the orientation, or the location of the dwelling on the lot. And it doesn't include using buffering or screening to, minimize physical or visual impacts. But it does provide that you cannot apply land development regulations relating to building design elements to single family or two family dwelling units unless it's basically historic building, either on the National Register or locally designated, or it's in a historic district. If the regulations are adopted in order to implement national flood insurance or building construction standards, if it is located in a community redevelopment area, if it's in a planned unit development or a master planned community, or if it is the regulations are required to ensure protection of coastal wildlife, and this is dealing with coastal construction and water resources, or, and this is very important, the dwelling is located within the jurisdiction of a local government that has a design review board or an architectural review board. And Lester, I think you have a little context for how that last bullet. Lester, I think you're muted.
Patty's coming.
Oh, you're not muted anymore.
Okay.
Now you're muted again.
Now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, this bill, the building code bill, was something that our members were very, very engaged in. There were a number of groups that met to organize, to reach out to their legislators from their communities. We worked very closely with the Florida League of Cities on this bill, and the best compromise we could arrive at relates to the final provision that Alex outlined for you. That is, that if these buildings are located in a district that are in a municipality that has a design review board or an architectural review board. And it also does not prevent municipalities who do not have those entities in place from adopting them. So if you want to avoid the nefarious effects of this bill, it would probably be a good idea to think about establishing a design review board or an architecture review board. We had a lot of help from our members in understanding the implications of that bill, and we're very grateful.
Thanks, Lester. So the bill does define PUD in a master plan community. It does state that it does not affect the validity or enforceability of private covenants or other contractual agreements relating to building design units. The effective date is July 1, 2021. And the unless otherwise expressly provided is because there were other provisions in the building code bill that I didn't highlight, but there were other provisions within there that weren't July 1, 2021, but this did not, this portion of the bill, it's July 1, 2021. And it hadn't been submitted to the governor yet. So the next bill I'm going to talk about is House Bill 487. This was sponsored by Representative Dugan, and the Senate version was Representative Perry. This bill passed unanimously in the Senate and passed 106 to 10 in the House. This is a bill that we have concerns about and are going to be joining other organizations to reach out to the governor in opposition of this bill. The major changes within it is it increases the thresholds for small scale amendments, and it increases them fivefold. It goes from 10 acres to 50 acres, and then in rural areas of opportunity, it goes from 20 to 100 acres. And, in current law, a small scale amendment is intended to be one that proposes a land use change to the future land use map for, and I'm going to quote, a site-specific small scale development activity. And, when it goes through this process, it only requires a single public hearing, which serves as the adoption hearing. So this bill is going to increase that threshold, fivefold. 100 acres does not seem to be the scale that represents a small scale development activity, particularly in rural areas. And it seems to be a, further erosion of the ability to look at development and its impacts, multi-jurisdictional or even potentially regional impacts. There's no limit on the number of small scale amendments that can be submitted in a year, and there's no limit on the number that a single developer could submit. So there's nothing really to control how much development can go through this very limited review process. The bill also allows somebody with a development order that existed before a municipality incorporated. It allows them now to abandon that order and develop the density and intensity as long as the uses are consistent with the local plan and the existing obligations in the development order regarding concurrency remain. And then it does have a provision that allows an entity that's created by interlocal agreement between two local governments to acquire title to a, wastewater or water facilities or property if 10 years has been passed since it was acquired through eminent domain acquisition, sorry. The effective date of this is July 1, 2021 as well. So now I'm going to turn to Senate Bill 896, and Lester mentioned this as one of the many, I think there's 41 various preemption bills that were filed this year, and this deals with solar facilities. It allows solar facilities to be a permitted use in all agricultural land use categories and all agricultural zoning districts within an unincorporated area. And the bill defines solar facility, and it means a production facility for electric power, which uses photovoltaic modules to convert solar energy to electricity that can be stored on site, delivered to a transmission system, and consumed primarily off-site. And then it has a bunch of other like mounting systems and other components that also are included with the solar facility. And in addition, it includes the accessory administration or maintenance buildings, the transmission lines, and those kinds of accessory uses. So those facilities are allowed to be in basically any agricultural land use district. It does require the facilities to comply with setbacks and landscape buffers. but only for similar uses in the agricultural district, and there's nothing in the bill that indicates what a similar use would be in an ag district. It does allow a county to adopt ordinances to specify these requirements, but again, they can't exceed those of similar uses involving construction of other facilities in those districts. It does not apply to a site that was subject to an application to construct a solar facility submitted to a local government before July 1, 2021. And Lester, I don't know if you have any info on that. I think that this has something to do with a facility that had been submitted to Alachua County and was turned down.
Yes, that's exactly what it was. There was a lot of an outcry by the residents of this small community who came to Tallahassee and testified remotely from the Civic Center about this bill. And so they carved out an exception for them.
Okay. So the effective date of this bill would be July 1, 2021, and it has not been submitted to the governor yet. So I'm going to now talk about House Bill 337. This is an impact fee bill that Lester mentioned, and it creates a new section, and it amends section 163.31801. And this bill was sponsored by Representative DeSigley, and it passed the House 94-23 and passed the Senate 28-12. And as the sponsor described it, he said that this bill is providing a glide path for how to handle impact fee increases. So basically what it does is it says that for an increase that's not more than 25%, it has to be implemented in 2 equal annual increments. So it has to be, it doesn't come into full effect until, the second year. For an increase of greater than 25%, but not more than 50%, you have to implement it in 4 equal annual increments. And then impact fees cannot be increased more than 50%, and they can't be increased more than once every 4 years. So that's consistent with that second bullet that says if you're going to have no more than 50%, it has to be over 4. It's basically over 4 years. And they cannot be increased retroactively for either the previous year or the current fiscal or calendar year. But there is a provision that allows you to bypass these limitations, but you can only do it if you have a completed demonstrated need study that justifies the increase within 12 months before the adoption. And that need study has to expressly demonstrate what are the extraordinary circumstances that are necessitating you going forward and trying to exceed the phase-in limitation. You have to have held no less than at least 2 publicly noticed workshops, and those have to be dedicated to the discussion of the extraordinary circumstances. And the impact fee increase has to be approved by a 2/3 vote of the governing body. The bill does provide that these provisions operate retroactively to January 1st, and I think that has to deal with some local governments that had adopted impact fees that were, I think they were greater than 50%. It does define public facilities as having the same meaning as in 163. It requires special districts to credit contribution to public facilities against impact fees. And then it defines infrastructure in the bill, The definition is up here on the screen, and it's including a fixed capital expenditure or capital outlay, life expectancy of 5 years, related land acquisition, does include fire department vehicles, emergency medical services, those kinds of things. And it requires that contributions to the improvement of infrastructure have to be credited. So if you're looking at impact fees and people have made contributions to the improvement of infrastructure, they have to be credited. But it does say that they don't have to credit it if you collected an impact fee for, you collected a contribution for infrastructure, but you don't have an impact fee category for that public facility. And it does provide that the existing provisions in statute that allow you to assign and transfer impact fee credits to other parcels can apply to all impact fee credits regardless of whether they were established before or after the effective date of this act. So the effective date is upon becoming law, and as of yet it has not been submitted to the governor. So now I'm going to talk about home-based business bill. It's House Bill 403. This is another bill that we are concerned about. And basically what it says is it preempts really the regulation of home-based businesses from local government, and says they can only regulate them in accordance with what's in this particular bill. It allows home-based businesses to operate in any area that's zoned for residential use. So there's no restriction on that. If it's zoned for residential use, home-based businesses can be there. You can't prohibit, restrict, regulate, or license these home-based businesses any different from other businesses in the jurisdiction. And it does say that clarifies that the home-based business only pays taxes in the county in which it's based. So
Basically, it eviscerates zoning.
I'm sorry, Lester?
It basically eviscerates zoning.
Yes. So what constitutes a home-based business? Well, you have to operate in whole or part from a residential property. You can have up to, you have to reside in the dwelling, but you can have up to 2 employees or independent contractors who are not residents can come work at the house. And then you can have additional employees who don't work at the residential dwelling working somewhere else. And so you're not restricted to just having 2 employees. You have to comply with parking in terms of local zoning ordinances, but you're allowed to have heavy equipment. You're allowed to have vehicles or trailers. You can't make the regulation of the trailers or vehicles any more stringent than those for residents where no business is conducted. It has to be consistent with the residential property. It has to be activities have to be secondary to the residential use. It does allow or does require you to comply with regulations related with respect to signage or vibration, noise, whatever, but the local regulations can't be more stringent than those that apply to a residence where no business is conducted. And the same thing with hazardous materials and those kinds of things. This was a highly contentious bill when it was going through the legislature, and other versions of the bill had other criteria such as hours of operation, external signage, things that would allow local governments to really look at the issue of balancing property rights and protecting character of the neighborhoods and character of the community. And those did not appear in the final version of the bill. It also allows anybody who's a current or a prospective, you don't even have to have an existing home-based business. They can challenge any local government action, and the prevailing party in the challenge can recover attorney's fees. It does say that the provisions don't supersede condominium, declarations, covenants, and cooperative documents. And it also says it doesn't supersede local laws, ordinances, or regulations related to transient lodging facilities. But like I said, this, and Lester said, this is really a deep reaching preemption bill that I know the League of Cities has asked for the governor to veto, and we are going to be reaching out as well. It hasn't been submitted to the governor yet, and the effective date would be July 1. So related, this is ended up being a related bill. It started out as a separate bill. It's another preemption. This is the preemption of the regulation of cottage food operations. And I think that you can see that some of these bills, I think, came out of people starting over the last year or so. More and more people were starting to work, from home. And I think that some of these people were reaching out to their legislators for help in being able to do that. But, a cottage food industry is basically regulated by Department of Agriculture right now, and it's basically any food that's not a potentially hazardous food. So what it does is this bill preempts the food operations to the state, and a local government cannot prohibit a food operation or regulate anything to do with its processing, storage, sale, or whatever. And the way it gets linked to the previous bill is that it requires the cottage food operation to comply with the conditions for the operation of the home-based business. That wasn't in the original bill, and that was kind of added at the end. It allows a cottage food operation to operate as a business entity. Right now, they can only operate as an individual or a person. It allows them to process or produce at the residence of somebody who has ownership in that entity. And the big change was that it allows the gross sales to be considered a cottage food industry. Before, your gross sales couldn't exceed $50,000, and now it's $250,000. So that's a lot of selling, homemade soap and jams and jellies, that kind of a thing. That's quite an increase. It also allows cottage food products now to be delivered and paid for and offered for sale through mail, which was not allowed before. So its effective date is tied to the effective date of House Bill 403, which is July 1. And this one has not been submitted to the governor as of yet. So another bill that I'm going to talk about is the property rights bill. This is one I think that you really need to talk to your attorney about. I am not an attorney, so I'm putting the disclaimer right up front. It does make a number of changes to the Burt-Harris Act. It was sponsored by Representative Pearson's Mulika, and it passed the House 79-37 and the Senate by 34-6. And I am going to go back. I'm sorry. I'm going to go back real quick. I forgot to tell you a story about the home-based business bills. It was kind of interesting. That passed the House 77-41. It passed in the Senate 19-18. And what happened was that when they took the vote on the Senate floor, there were 3 senators who were on the floor that
Didn't vote.
did not vote. And if you're on the floor, you are supposed to vote. And so after the Senate voted and they had approved it 19 to 18, they sent it out into messages back to the House, and then a point of order was raised. And so the rules chair looked at it, and after about 15 minutes apparently said yes, that that was a violation of the Senate rules. The 3 people should have voted, and said that they could ask the House to send it back. So the Senate asked the House to send it back, but before that occurred, and I don't know how much time there was in between, they went to sine die and the legislative session ended. So I had been looking at I would use lobby tools, and I was looking at lobby tools, and I had never seen that before. And so it was a very curious thing that happened. So, but since they didn't send it back, it's assumed it'll be submitted to the governor for his signature. So sorry, I meant to tell you that before and I forgot. So going back to the Burt-Harris Act, there are there's a number of changes. There's a couple of major changes I just want to highlight. One is that the amendment to 70.0012 that says that if you are entitled to relief under Burt-Harris, you can retain that entitlement to that relief, and you can pursue the claim even if you sold the property before. If you filed the claim and then you sell it, you still can pursue the claim. It makes a number of other changes. It amends the time frame for when a claimant has to notify the local government from 150 days to 90 days. It now provides that written settlement offers are presumed to protect the public interest. It also says that if you are the property owner and you prevail in your action, you can recover attorney fees and costs from the time that you file notice with the government you're going to do so, as opposed to when you actually file the suit. And there is existing language in the law that requires the court to determine that, look at the settlement offers that might have been provided by the local government and look to see whether those constitute a bona fide offer, and that language is deleted. So there's no looking at by the court at what the settlement offers constituted anymore. And then the other big amendment is the amendment to 70.00111, the third bullet, that says you are no longer required to formally pursue an application for a development order or building permit to bring a claim. You just have to file your claim within a year after you receive the local government's notice that there are limitations of use imposed on the property. So you don't have to actually pursue a development permit or a building permit to bring the claim under the act anymore. And then it says, it defines imposed or imposition as to the time that the property owner has to comply with the prohibited exaction. And you can sue as soon as you have to comply with that exaction. And it then makes some changes under the Land Use and Environmental Dispute Act so that real property has the same meanings as in the Burt-Harris Act. This effective date is October 1st, 2021, and it has not been submitted to the governor. But again, this is a bill that's, it's got such legal ramifications that I would suggest you talk to your local attorney about this bill. So I'm going to turn it over to Whit again and let him talk about some broadband and transportation bills.
Alex, I wanted to ask, we do have a number of questions on some of the bills that you presented. Do you want to try and address those now, or do you want to wait and hold them?
Why don't we wait till the end? Or if there's a couple, we can try to deal with them now. That's fine.
Let's go through a couple of them and just see how long that takes you. The first one, it goes back to the property rights bill that passed, and the question is, does the property rights element have to be an element, or can the statements be added into the future land use element? Would that be okay?
I would talk to your local attorney, but the bill doesn't say it has to be a separate element, but it does call it an element. So, most of the other items in the comp plan that are called elements are separate. So, but it didn't specify.
I think that was certainly the legislative intent, that it be a separate element.
Yeah, I think the point was to call it out.
Yes.
Yeah, just want to feature it.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question goes to, you got a few on House Bill 401. Would a setback for a garage be considered regulating the location of a garage as prohibited in House Bill 401?
I'm not an attorney. I would say if you're saying it can't be located here because it has to be located there because there's a setback, I think it might be. You can't, it doesn't define what the location of orientation of the garage says. That's all it says. But if you're telling me I can't put it here, I have to put it here because of a setback, I would say that was location of the garage.
All right, thanks for that legal interpretation.
No, I'm not an attorney. I am
You're
prefacing all of these. Talk to your local attorney.
Another one about 401 is how does the bill work for those that already had plans and regulations in place that cover areas not in a CRA, for instance?
I would say that if you look at that list of things where it said you can't apply them unless it's one of these things, and if it doesn't fit into that list and you're not in a jurisdiction that has a design review board or an architectural review board, I would interpret that you're prohibited from applying them to single family or two dwelling unit residential units. It's pretty specific, saying you cannot apply them unless the following. And if it doesn't meet any of the following, you can't apply it.
How is a design review board or architectural review board defined in the legislation?
It is not defined.
Not defined. Okay. Why don't we stop there and then we can come back. You've got some others on some different bills, and let's see how much time we have. I want to make sure we have enough time to cover what we need to cover.
Okay. So you're up.
I guess so. All right. Well, I'm going to cover some of the broadband and transportation related. These are all a little bit tied together. House Bill 1239 is a broadband internet service bill that passed that creates two new programs to support the expansion of broadband internet service. And you may recall that with the MCORS legislation that passed under Senator Galvano's leadership a couple of years ago, that it defined not only toll roads, but also broadband as part of that. So I think in recognition of the state's budget challenges at the beginning of this year, there was a desire to maybe split those off and deal with them separately. So that's where we had the genesis of the broadband internet service. And this creates statute 288-9962 to establish the Broadband Opportunity Program with the Office of Broadband. And it's designed to award grants to applicants who seek to install or deploy infrastructure that expands broadband service to unserved areas. It establishes entities that are eligible for those kinds of grants, provides application requirements and evaluation criteria. It requires the Office of Broadband to enter into an agreement with each grant recipient, outlines performance conditions, potential sanctions for failure to meet those conditions, et cetera. And it limits the grant awards to 50% of the total cost. So there is some sort of a local match required. Specifies that a single project may not be awarded a grant in excess of $5 million, and prohibits grant awards for projects that receive other federal funding. And there's more to it. It creates another section of statutes that deal with the attachment of broadband facilities to municipal electric poles, requires those electric utilities through July 1st, 2024 to offer broadband service providers a discounted rate of $1 per attachment per year for any new pole attachment necessary to make broadband service available. It provides safety and reliability standards for pole attachments, specifies who's responsible for what, and how those replacement poles will be apportioned out in terms of cost. It prohibits municipal electric utilities from raising their current pole attachment rates for broadband providers between 2021 and July 31st, 2022. And then it requires local technology planning teams established by the office to work with rural communities to help identify unserved and underserved customers in rural areas. And then it requires local technology planning teams to work with rural communities and broadband providers to identify opportunities to reduce barriers to deployment of service. And finally, it amends the information required to be included in the strategic plan addressing broadband internet service in the state that is currently required to be developed by the office, and requires it to be submitted to the governor, the Senate president, and House speaker within a year, June 30th of 2022. And then there's a 1.5 million appropriation in general revenue funds to DEO to develop geographic information system maps of broadband internet service availability throughout the state to be completed by 2022. So the bill's effective this July, and it was signed by the governor just about a week ago. All right, so kind of tied to that, and that broadband bill was unanimously approved. Lester, did you want to add something on that?
No, I was just saying the bill you're bringing up right now is really significant.
Yeah, this was a big one that we watched, and again, it was kind of tethered to the whole broadband issue previously. This one was introduced by Senator Harrell, and you know, it was interesting. Just 2 years ago, the legislature pretty much uniformly, well, I won't say uniformly, but there was an overwhelming majority approving the MCOR's toll roads that connected different parts of the state, the Heartland Parkway, the Suncoast Extension, and the Turnpike Extension. And there was a lot of effort put into that in terms of resources by the state to create task forces and study these things. A significant amount of work went into developing and analyzing them, but the task force conclusions were really, what's the right way to say it? They were not conclusive that there was a need for these toll roads. Is that a fair way to represent it, Lester?
Exactly to say it, yes.
And so when the pandemic hit, a lot of us in the transportation planning arena were very fearful of the impacts that it was going to have on the FDOT work program, our local transportation budgets, and recognizing that there was a significant commitment, not only currently, but to future budgets to develop these toll roads in the rural areas, that we were really concerned that priorities established through the Metropolitan Planning program, through the FDOT districts, through the Turnpike, all of those would have been essentially undermined by this legislative commitment that the DOT couldn't really back away from without legislative approval. So there was an effort to really develop legislation that would have changed that. And I want to thank Jo Penrose. I don't know if she's on the line, but she sent me pretty much weekly updates about Senate Bill 100, which was very helpful as we track this. So this passed unanimously in the House, and there was only one vote against it in the Senate, maybe somebody who felt some loyalty to Senator Galvano. But this repeals the multi-use corridors of regional economic significance and its related provisions, and it creates instead programs that redirect resources to arterial highway projects that already exist, such as the US 19 corridor along Florida's Gulf Coast. Excuse me. And it requires FDOT in coordination with the Turnpike Enterprise to evaluate existing roadways or portions of those roadways for development of specific controlled access facilities and include such programs in the work program. And you know, honestly, that's a much more predictable and better deal that ties into other priorities that exist in the state. And I think it provides for a more rational development of those programs. It authorizes DOT to upgrade existing arterial roadways with targeted improvements. And they could be tolled or non-tolled. And those could manage congestion points, retrofitting roadways, bring them up to standards, and make intersection improvements and signalization changes and things like that. You know, so instead of cutting a swath through undeveloped land, it really kind of takes what's already been disturbed and seeks to enhance that. It prohibits any reduction of non-toll general use lanes of an existing facility, requires maintenance of existing access points and provision of access to property owners with no property access, and limits the location of any tolling points such that non-tolled alternatives for local traffic, we need to advance, or for local traffic, I think that's it. It subjects portions of any project to be told to federal and state environmental reviews and to generally the same review and development requirements that exist for FDOT's projects. It requires the department to take into consideration the guidance and recommendations of the previous studies or reports relative to the MCORS program, and that's a significant deal.
Yes.
Because those task force reports were generally unfavorable in some respects to the certain aspects of those toll roads, and that was, I believe, added later in the bill. That was not an original provision. And it requires any existing applicable requirements related to turnpike projects to be undertaken by the Turnpike Enterprise. And then the Turnpike Enterprise also has to take into consideration the guidance of those recommendations in previous reports. So there's nobody working outside that framework. And the Turnpike Enterprise has to also take into consideration the guidance and recommendations of previous studies related to the extension of the Turnpike from its northerly terminus up in Wildwood. Next slide, please. There's a lot to this bill, as you can see. It directs DOT to consider innovative concepts to combine right-of-way acquisition with the acquisition of lands or easements, so that'll facilitate environmental mitigation, water quality protection and restoration. It also has the ability to advance these projects a little more quickly. States that to the greatest extent practical roadway alignments, project alignment, and interchange locations shall be designed so that rights of way are not located within the conservation lands acquired under Florida Preservation 2000 or the Florida Forever Act. It directs DOT to develop and include in the work program construction of controlled access facilities to achieve free flow of traffic on US 19, beginning at the terminus of the Suncoast Parkway, Phase 2, Phase 3, north to the next logical terminus on Interstate 10 in Madison County. And it requires the facility to be developed using existing roadways or portions of existing roadways. And it requires the facility to be developed no later than December of 2035. So there's still a pretty strong commitment to getting those conditions completed. And it directs DOT to identify and include in the work program projects to widen certain two-lane arterial rural roads serving high volume truck traffic to 4 lanes and provides funding for such project. And DOT has to begin the project development environmental phase, or PD&E, for a project to extend the Florida Turnpike from the Wildwood terminus to a terminus determined by DOT, and submit a status report to the governor by December of 2022, and the Senate President and the House as well. It retains in the State Transportation Trust Fund the revenue redirected to it as a result of the 2019 MCORS legislation for purposes of funding the authorized controlled access facility projects and widening projects on the arterial rural highway. So this bill goes into effect in about a month, and it's not yet submitted to the governor as of yesterday.
I think, if I might add, Whit, significantly that under the provisions of this bill, the new planning for the, for example, the US 19 extension must consider the no build option, which was one of the task force recommendations. So those of you who participated in the task forces or know people who do, you should be really proud that this legislation does recognize in a number of ways, but most significantly, in my view, the consideration of the no build option.
We have one question on this bill. I don't know the answer to it. Does this mean that lane repurposing is no longer allowed on arterials?
No, I don't take it to mean that. I think the bill is focused more on the specific corridors that were identified and for rural roadways. So I think within an urban environment, this would not preclude an arterial lane repurposing project.
Okay, thank you.
We'll definitely look into that and verify that, but that's been my understanding. I think we would have had a lot of red flags about this bill if that provision had been the case, and I have not heard anything like that. Okay, moving on to House Bill 1954. This was the statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience, and you know, I guess I would just like to say it's a bit of a nice breath of fresh air that we're actually seeing legislation and hearing talking points from statewide elected officials about the existence of sea level rise and the factors that lead to that. It wasn't too long ago that you would not have seen any legislation like this, and so it is progress. This program creates the Resilient Florida Grant Program within the Florida Department of Environmental Protection that provides a funding mechanism subject to appropriation to local governments for the cost of community resilience planning and data collection, planning, and other related activities. So I think this is definitely needed. It allows for comprehensive amendments and necessary corresponding analyses that address the requirements of Section 163. It includes vulnerability assessments that identify or address risks of flooding and sea level rise in communities, development of projects, plans, and policies that allow communities to prepare for threats from flooding and sea level rise, and includes projects to adapt critical assets to the effects of flooding and sea level rise. This bill provides that the vulnerability assessments must encompass the entire jurisdiction and include all critical assets owned or maintained by the grant applicant unless DEP approves something smaller. And it requires the assessment to include an analysis of the vulnerability of and risk to critical assets, including regionally significant assets owned or managed by the county or municipality. And it creates the comprehensive statewide flood vulnerability and sea level rise data set and assessment to be updated every 5 years. And I believe this ties in well with the Digital Coast law that is being pushed in Congress. So there'll be a tie-in at the state level with what's being pushed nationally. It requires DEP by July of 2022 to develop a statewide data set. Again, that's tied into this Digital Coast national legislation, sufficient to conduct statewide flood vulnerability and sea level rise assessments. And by July of 23, the state has to develop a statewide assessment based on the data set that identifies inland and coastal infrastructure, geographic areas, and communities in the state that are vulnerable, easy for me to say, to flooding and sea level rise and the associated risks. And I think this just really does set a good platform for future actions, both at the local and at the state level. This is one we're going to have to stay on, though, and push. It creates a statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience plan, requires DEP by December of this year to submit a plan on a 3-year planning horizon that includes ranked projects that address the risks of flooding and sea level rise to coastal and inland communities in Florida. And it restricts the total amount of funding proposed for each year to $100 million. Now, that's not nearly sufficient for what we need statewide, but again, it's a start and it's a step in the right direction. It requires each project included in the plan to have a minimum of 50% cost share. So there is a significant local commitment unless the project exists or is within a financially disadvantaged small community as defined in the bill. It allows local governments and regional resilience entities, water management districts, flood control districts to evaluate projects and submit a project list to DEP. And it requires DEP to implement a scoring system for assessment projects for inclusion in the plan, including the criteria and tiers identified in the bill. And I imagine this will be subject to a lot of scrutiny as well.
Oh, yeah.
And that'll be rulemaking, right, Lester?
Yes, sir. There'll be a lot of rulemaking.
And this authorizes local governments to form regional resilience entities whose responsibilities include the planning for resilience needs of communities and coordinating intergovernmental solutions to mitigate adverse impacts. And I'll just say, you know, in the Tampa Bay region, that's coordinated by the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. So good thing we didn't kill the regional planning councils. It authorizes DEP to provide funding to the regional resilience entities for specified activities. It establishes the Florida Food Hub for applied research, Flood Hub, sorry. Food Hub sounds pretty good though too. Flood Hub for applied research and innovation at the University of South Florida to coordinate and lead statewide efforts for research and innovation regarding flooding and sea level rise. And it requires the Office of Economic and Demographic Research to include an analysis of the cost of specified resilience efforts in its annual assessment. And so this is effective upon becoming law. And so since the governor approved it on May 12th, this is now the law of the state.
I would just underscore Whit's comments that the precedent that this provides for the state's involvement in resiliency planning, sea level rise is really, really important.
And as a result, I mean, it was passed unanimously, so no opposition, and that's also a good sign. All right, I'm gonna, I believe, turn it back over to Alex. Is that right? And you're gonna help me with some of these things? All right.
Yep. I'm going to move quickly because we're kind of running out of time, and I think there's a couple of questions I think would be good to get to. So this is another preemption bill. It's kind of an odd one. Lester, I don't know if you know the provenance of this bill in terms of what pushed it moving forward, but it's basically dealing with.
Yes, there was a rumor that a certain municipality in Florida was going to ban new gas stations. And so they decided to make sure you couldn't do that.
Yeah, okay. Well, this passed the House 79-38 and the Senate 26-12. And really what it says is local governments and special districts can't do anything that prohibits the siting, the development, or the redevelopment of a gas station and its related transportation infrastructure within the entirety of your jurisdictional boundary. And it defines fuel retailer as the fuel station or the retail site that sells fuel to power vehicles. And then it has the related transportation infrastructure as the tanks, the pipes, the equipment that's necessary to get the fuel and dispense the fuel. And then it doesn't let you do anything that would result in a de facto prohibition of a real fuel retailer within the entirety of your jurisdictional boundary. And it also prohibits you from requiring, and this goes back to a bill that Whit had talked about earlier, about requiring a fuel retailer to put in things like electrical vehicle charging stations. So basically you have to leave the gas stations alone. They just need to dispense gas if that's all they want to do. And then it had says it doesn't preempt you from doing a law, an ordinance, a regulation that deals with the siting, the development or redevelopment, if it doesn't result in the de facto prohibition of these uses from being cited, developed, or redeveloped within zoning or land use classifications where it's consistent with other allowable uses. Excuse me. So it hasn't been submitted to the governor yet, and the effective date is July 1st. This one Lester really talked about before. This was the redistribution of the dock stamp, the $209 million to affordable housing, and then diverting the programs to other uses dealing with sea level rise and wastewater treatment. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that. And I'm just going to go ahead and do this section. These are bills that also passed but haven't been submitted to the governor. They finally approved abolishing the Constitution Revision Commission. There's created a Florida Wildlife Corridor Act, which was creates incentives for conservation and conserving a green infrastructure, which is basically a defined corridor through the state. There was a bill dealing with bike and pedestrian safety. The preemption bill from last year of local occupational licensing passed this year, which preempts it to the state. Somebody had asked a question about this bill in the question box. This is House Bill 667. Oh no, this is not the one, sorry. This allows local government or allows enforcement agencies to get requests for inspections submitted electronically. This is the one, Senate Bill 60, which says that you can't investigate potential violations based on an anonymous complaint. So that means you have to have somebody give you your name and their information before you can investigate a potential violation, unless the violation presents an imminent threat to public health, safety, or welfare, or imminent destruction of habitat or sensitive resources. And this would take effect July 1, 2021. These have not been submitted to the governor yet. There's a bill focusing on elimination of and incentives for gray water technology, some school funding, amending requirements for what building permit information has to be posted on county websites. DOT's legislative package went forward, and this does include language similar to what Whit was talking about in the Senate Bill 100, which was the MCORS bill. And then amending legal notices to allow for website publication. There is a new tolling and extension of permits. Senate Bill 12 adds certain DEP or water management district permits that were issued for land subject to a development agreement. It extends those, and it also extends the expiration dates of certain development permits or agreements. You might want to take a look at that to see if you have any that would be affected by that. It's would become effective upon becoming law, but hasn't been submitted to the governor yet. And it's the way it works, according to the staff reports, is this is done so that the state of emergency that was issued for COVID the tolling would apply to that state of emergency. The regulation of seaports, I'm sure you have read a lot about this in the newspaper. It's basically saying that local ballots and initiatives or referendums can't restrict maritime commerce. It was
It
tied to,
overturns a referendum that was passed in the Florida Keys that would have restricted the size and number of passengers on cruise ships.
yeah, and it was these bills, there were separate bills that originally dealt with this, and they were postponed on, the House bill was postponed on second reading twice. The Senate bill actually passed the Senate, but everything got bogged down. So when this is like a transportation financing bill, and so Senator Boyd proposed an amendment to 1194 when it came up, and it included this language, and that's how it ended up getting passed. I think that the people in opposition for it thought it had died, but it got attached to this bill. And then this one, we talked about House Bill 421, we talked about. So I guess we could go back to the questions. We have a few minutes left. And there was, let me look. There was a general question, Lester, for you that was, is there any significance to these bills not having been submitted to the governor yet?
No, none at all. The legislature, the presiding officers in the House and the Senate control the flow of legislation to the governor. So as long as they're submitted before the end of the fiscal year, they're fine. And it's, you could think of it as a courtesy. They don't want to send all the 250 odd bills at once. This, at least theoretically, provides for more rational consideration of the bills as they control the flow of them to the governor.
Okay. And then there was a question in regards to the property rights element. Was there any discussion about what might go into data and analysis, or can we simply adopt a goal, objective, and policy that restates the statutory language? I'm not aware of any discussion about what would be required. The bill states that you can adopt the model element that's in the statute. So I think if you took what was in the statute and you adopted that, that is what they're anticipating you need. But I don't know. I know that somebody, Kelly Corvin, was on here. You might want to reach out to DEO to see how they're interpreting that. She was on here, she signed off, but she said that in response to the question about whether it should be a standalone element or whether it could be added, she said she advised that it should be a standalone element. It shouldn't just be added to the future land use element or some other element. Let me see what else. On the code enforcement bill, it says, does this preclude the officers of reporting instead of the anonymous person? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, the thrust of the legislation is to prevent anonymous complaints, but I don't know how that would be interpreted.
I don't either.
I will add that I heard from the city of St. Petersburg that they might need to beef up their code enforcement staff to address that, because they get a significant number of anonymous complaints now.
Somebody asked, and Whit, if you see any questions in here that somebody did ask if you could talk, Lester, if there was time, a tiny bit about future redistricting.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Every 10 years, as a result of the census, the legislature reapportions both itself, that is the House and the Senate, and the state's congressional districts. As a result of the census results that were received in late April, Florida will gain 1 congressional seat. It will likely be in the Central Florida area where there's been such explosive growth over the past 10 years. It's a shame. A lot of states, California, for example, spent a lot of money to raise citizen awareness of the census. Florida did very little and started late. The conventional wisdom was that Florida would pick up 2, maybe even 3 new seats, but we ended up with 1. And this will, the efforts to do the maps will begin over the summer. There'll probably be hearings in conjunction with the interim legislative committee meetings in the fall, and then the legislature will consider the redistricting plans in the 2022 regular session. Those then are reviewed by the Florida Supreme Court, and if the past is any indicator of the future, there'll be lots of legal challenges. A long, complicated process with very high stakes.
I think we maybe have time for 1 or so more questions. We're past the 1:30 time period. Somebody asked, how is a design review board or architectural review board defined? And it is not defined in the bill. So unless there's another definition somewhere in statute, it isn't defined.
Alex, there's one question about 403, where parking is addressed for home-based businesses, but not customer traffic, i.e. trip generation. And do you believe that that means customer trips cannot be directly regulated? And that's my understanding, but I'm not sure. You've looked at that closer than I have.
Yeah, I mean, let me look at it. It's focusing on parking and says the need for parking can't be greater than in volume. And it doesn't really say anything about how many people can or cannot come to your business. So I don't think it really addresses that. There's no, no consideration of trips coming there or trips that would be generated by the business. It's focusing really on parking.
Well, we know for one thing, we won't get any anonymous complaints about it.
That's right.
Exactly.
But if I could, I'd like to thank Alex. The legislative reporting, I thought this year, timely, comprehensive, and really, really helpful to me, and I hope to the members, and also to you and the members of the Legislative Policy Committee. We had several instances where we needed quick turnaround analysis of the real world implications of legislation, and we got it. It was really helpful. The building design bill was just one example of that. So I'm very grateful for the help that I got from our members.
And do you want to mention the survey?
Yeah, there is going to be a short email that everybody will receive after this concludes with a few survey questions, about 5 questions. It won't take you long. And then please take note of the CM event number that will be in the email as well when you log your CM credits for this. And I just want to thank everybody for participating and attending today, for the great questions. I'll work with Alex and Lester to try and answer any questions that we didn't answer and see how we can provide a response. And certainly the information in this PowerPoint will be posted for anybody to review. Alex and Lester, thank you so much. You guys did a great job, and I really appreciate both of your hard work this legislative session.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody.